Hi, fourth grade reading. I hope you guys are doing well. Today, I'm very excited because we are starting our study on our first female American poet, and her name is Emily Dickinson. In this lesson, you are going to need a pen or a pencil. You are going to need your Emily Dickinson PowerPoint that I sent to your parents, and also a sheet that says supporting details to find evidence in the poem, kind of like analysis questions for Emily Dickinson. Okay? I am going to be sharing my screen with you all for this lesson, so it's a little bit easier to follow along this time. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. Okay. On your screen, you have a photo of Emily Dickinson. She was a famous American poet who lived from 1830 to 1886. You can see her birthday is December 10th and her death date is May 15th. So, quick warm up. How old was Emily Dickinson when she died? You might want to go ahead and do the math real quick and pause my video. So we take 1886 and we're going to subtract 1830 to figure out how long she lived. Oops, sorry. Okay, if you figured it out, you got the answer 56. She was 56 years old when she died, and I just love Emily Dickinson because she was different than most women of her time. Most women of her time were expected to get married, have children, take care of the home, and not say too much. Women who were outspoken were often judged, and Emily Dickinson was very outspoken. She also refused to marry. Her parents very much wanted her to get married, but she did not want to. She was so in love with her writing and her poetry. And her parents really weren't that supportive of it. She often got teased for her love of writing, but she would spend all day in her room writing. So here she is. And here is a picture of the museum, the Emily Dickinson Museum, and it's actually her home that she grew up in, this beautiful yellow brick house. And today it's dedicated to her poetry, and I'm going to show you later. We're going to take a short virtual tour of Emily Dickinson's bedroom, because in her later life, she was a recluse, which means she very rarely left the home, very similar to us right now with the coronavirus. So it's perfect that we're studying Emily Dickinson because she did not leave her home for the last years of her life. She spent a lot of time in her room just writing. She had a great imagination. So this is her home. Today we're going to read a poem called Because I Could Not Stop for Death. In all of Emily Dickinson's poems, the titles are usually the first line of the poem. So that's actually the first line of the poem too. I have a warm-up for you to get us ready to analyze this poem. Okay, and then we'll go over our objectives and jump right in. Do you remember abstract nouns from Voyages? If you do, you know right here that an abstract noun is a noun that is an idea rather than a concrete object. So an abstract noun cannot be experienced by the five senses. Remember our examples, things like friendship, love, hope, and peace. I can't hold peace, I can't smell it, I can't taste it, but it is an idea. Do you also remember personification from reading class? That's when we give human characteristics to something non-human, or the representation of an abstract quality in human form. For example, the wind sang, this should be sang, not sand. The wind sang her mournful song through the falling leaves. Well, I know wind is not a person, and I know wind cannot literally sing, but here we're giving the human quality of singing, and we also gave wind a gender. Wind is female because there's a pronoun her, okay? And personification can be really fun. We have Beauty and the Beast, which is a huge example of personification with talking clocks. Well, Emily Dickinson personifies death in this poem. So I have a question for you. If you had to personify the abstract noun joy, what would joy be like? So if joy was a person or had human qualities, would joy be male or female? What kind of car would joy ride? What would their voice sound like? What would they look like? And how would they act? Well, joy is an abstract noun that means extreme happiness, right? So joy might drive a convertible, right? A fun convertible car. Joy might have a very outgoing, loud personality, right? They would act positive, see the positive in every single situation, right? They're never down in the dumps. Well, Emily Dickinson's most popular poem combines these two ideas that we just reviewed: abstract noun and personification. Is death an abstract noun? Yes, death is, because I cannot point to something and say, oh, that's death. I can see examples of it, like a corpse or a gravestone or a tomb, right? We have symbols in our church that kind of represent death on Good Friday, and we cover the statues. But death, and this poem that Emily Dickinson is going to do, is a person, and death is a male. So I'm going to scroll down so you can see right here. Emily Dickinson's most popular poem combines these two ideas of abstract nouns and personification, and it is called Because I Could Not Stop for Death. She personifies death as a person, a male, and he comes to pick her up in a carriage. She even uses the pronoun he. And death has been personified before. You might have seen death as kind of the Grim Reaper, right, with the black hood. And he's really scary and kind of a shadowy, mysterious figure that has that, I don't know, not a pitchfork. You guys know what I mean with like the curved weapon that he carries. I can't think of the name right now. But in this poem, death is not really scary. He's more of like a gentleman who is kind and respectful and civil. So we're going to go ahead and read her poem. We're going to analyze the poem, and we're going to find some new poetic devices in this poem as well. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing that, and I'm going to share another PowerPoint with you. And I'm going to go full screen. So we're going to go ahead and, if I can find it, play the slideshow. Okay, poetry analysis. Our two objectives are, we're going to analyze this poem, right? We're going to break it down like we did our other poems. And we're going to find some new poetic devices or some new poetic terms. Some examples are anaphora. That should be a very new word for you, anaphora. And we're also going to find things like great imagery that we've learned before in our figurative language unit. Okay. You also have a copy of the poem that I want you to take out right now. And here's an original sketch of Emily Dickinson. Okay. Here's the poem. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day, I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And I'm sorry that bottom section cut off there, but you have the full poem. Let's break this poem down. There's tons of figurative language in here and tons of things that probably don't make any sense to you right now, but we're going to go ahead and break it down. Okay. You just follow along. Okay, so death is personified. If you notice right here, death starts with a capital D, right? And he's given a name, right? And pronouns as well. Okay, so and the rhyme pattern is A, B, C, B, right? Death, me, just, ourselves, immortality. And immortality is personified as well. So immortality is a person too, because it has a capital I, right? So death is coming to pick her up in a carriage. And she says, because I could not stop for death. So was she ready for death to come for her? No, it says she could not stop. So he stops for her. But she uses the word kindly. He kindly stops. Well, in movies, we see examples of death as not so kind. So that might be an example of irony. And each line in a poem has a number, by the way. So we want to look at lines 3 and 4. Lines 3 and 4 create imagery of 3 people. So we have the speaker, because it's first person I. We have death, capital D is a person, and immortality. Okay? And they're in a horse-drawn carriage, right? We have 2 horses pulling this carriage. And the word kind, we know, is ironic because, stopping for death doesn't really seem kind. It would be the opposite, like horrifying, right? And so death is coming to take the speaker away. So it's kind of a creepy tone, right? Okay, let's look at the second stanza. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. So the drive symbolizes that the speaker is leaving her life behind. When you're driving away from something, right, you're leaving it behind. Labor here means work, and leisure means fun, and to be civil means to be nice. So, and we know haste, he knew no haste. Haste means fast or rapid. So this kind of symbolizes a slow death. He's picking her up slowly. It's not quick in the night. So let's look at the bottom. It says, the speaker describes death as a man who is kind, slow, and civil, arriving in a carriage. He is not frightening like the Grim Reaper, but it is kind of romantic. It's like a romantic date with death. He picks her up in a carriage. He's kind. He's gentlemanlike. So this is kind of opposite of what we usually see as death being personified as something to be frightened, something that comes quick and maybe violent. This is not it. Okay. We already talked about the slow pace of the drive represents a slow death. Okay. This is my favorite part. Well, one of my favorite parts. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Okay. Now, notice the word past is repeated 3 times. This is a hint to us that the speaker is passing away. We also see alliteration of some of the letters S, R, G, and S. Now they're passing a school. They're passing recess. And so we're kind of being brought back to before you die, you might be remembering and all of your childhood memories that were precious to you. Then it says, we pass the fields of grain gazing and setting sun. Well, when sun sets, right, it means the end of the day, right? And everything is darkening. Does that remind you of death too? Of course. There's a certain darkness to mortality on earth, right? So gazing grain and setting sun are symbols of old age. And recess and school are symbols of youth, of young age. So as she's slowly passing away, she's remembering these stages in her life. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. Whoa, there's a lot popping up on our screen. Okay, so we feel the setting here. So dews drew quivering and chill. Now we're getting to kind of the scary part of death, right? Chill is often symbolizing death because your body goes chill when you die, right? But now it tells us what she's wearing. Okay, gossamer my gown. Gossamer gives us an image of a wedding dress or a burial shroud. So something that is really nice white material. And it says, my tippet only tulle. And tippet is like a shawl that you wear, kind of like a scarf, ladies. And tulle is a material used in wedding veils. Okay, so she is dressed, right, kind of for death, right? Something formal. This is an excellent use of imagery right here. You can kind of see fields of gazing grain and setting sun, right? And look at the alliteration, gazing grain, setting sun. It's easy to picture this in your mind. Okay. Now, I mentioned a word anaphora at the beginning of this lesson. Anaphora is when a word is repeated throughout a poem. Okay, not a refrain. Remember, refrain is an entire line that's repeated. Anaphora is words that are repeated. So what's repeated? Past, past, past. Okay, this is where it gets a little bit more creepy. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice but a mound. There's more alliteration. Say, okay. Oh, by the way, a 4-line stanza is called a quatrain, right? Our Greek and Latin roots, quat. And the house is a metaphor for a grave because it says it's a house, but it's in the ground and the roof is scarcely visible. So think of a tombstone that's coming out of the ground. Okay? So they're not passing a literal house, they're passing her grave. Ooh. So we're getting this chilling tone, this kind of scary, dark tone. Okay, here's another huge word. When you personify an idea to the point of creating a personified character, it's called, sound this out with me, anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism. Okay, here's our next stanza. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet each feels shorter than the day, I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Okay, you see day and eternity, they sound like they rhyme, but they don't actually. It's a near rhyme. Okay, so since then 'tis centuries. Whoa, okay. So it felt like that poem was in present tense, right? That it was happening as we were reading it. But all of a sudden she goes, no, this happened hundreds of years ago. So she's speaking to us from the grave. And she's been dead for centuries. Now, we kind of have a feeling of that the afterlife in this poem does exist because she mentions eternity, right? Okay. So the speaker has calmly accepted her death and is speaking to us beyond the grave. Okay, I would like you to reread the poem, and I want you to visualize the imagery and think about all the different levels of meanings of this poem. Here's some Emily Dickinson trivia to kind of end the PowerPoint lesson. Emily Dickinson was known as the woman in white. That's why I'm wearing white. She mostly wore white dresses. In her later years, she rarely left the house like we are now, right? I told you that. And she requested that when she died, her coffin be hand carried across a field of flowers to her grave. So Dickinson was kind of obsessed with this idea of death. Maybe because she spent all this time alone in her room and she went crazy. But yeah, and she actually ended up burning some of her poems and stories, but she kept some of her poems locked up in this little chest drawer. And her sister lived past Emily Dickinson, and her sister was searching her room, and her sister found this chest, and she found hundreds and hundreds of poems by Emily Dickinson, and her sister published them after her death. So Dickinson wasn't even famous during her time of life. She was famous posthumously, which means she became famous after she died. So she never got to really know on earth that her poems were so beloved by so many people, especially women. And there's an original sketch of her. Okay, so we are done with our analysis. Now you have a sheet that has questions on it, and I'm going to share my screen to show that with you, or to you. This sheet right here. It says supporting inferences with evidence, Emily Dickinson. Okay, you guys are going to answer these questions, and we're going to go over the answers in our Zoom meeting. Okay, so you're going to use the poem to answer the questions. I'll help you out with the first maybe 2, and I want you to do 3, 4, and 5. So here are our directions. We have to find evidence to support the inferences below. And it says, write a quote from the poem in the blanks. I'm going to use my whiteboard to type the answers, on Zoom to answer these questions for you. But before we do that, real quick, I want to show you something pretty cool. Let me share my screen again. Number 1, at the end of this lesson, you're going to watch a Brain Pop video on Emily Dickinson, and it shares more of her poems with you. Here's what it looks like on YouTube. You can also visit emilydickinsonmuseum.org, and you can explore it. And the coolest thing that's in there is you can do a virtual tour of her house. We're going to look at a virtual mini tour of her bedroom. This is her bedroom, guys. This is where she spent most of her life writing and reading. And her bedroom was upstairs in that yellow house. And this is not a ghost right here. This white dress is not Emily Dickinson's ghost. It's just one of her dresses that they preserved. And they've preserved this house so well. This is exactly what her room looked like. So let's look around. She had the floral wallpaper and kind of gold curtains. Her family was wealthy. This is the coolest part because you can see her desk with her little lamp, and her desk was in front of the window so she could see out into her neighborhood. She's got paintings, a little fireplace. Very cool. There's her bed. Isn't that neat? I just think that's so, so cool that her house has been preserved as this museum, and we can see the very place where her poetry became famous. So super, super cool. Okay, I'm gonna stop sharing there. And let's get to that sheet with the questions, and I'm gonna start you guys out. You can see my whiteboard, and I'm going to type in my text box. Question number 1 says, the first line states that Emily Dickinson, or the speaker, could not stop for death. Hence, she's not choosing death, right? Or excuse me, the question says, how do you know that the speaker was unprepared for death? Well, number 1, we will write the first line states that she could not stop for death. Hence, she was not choosing death, right? He had to stop for her. She was unprepared. Okay. Number 2 says the author uses words with positive connotations to describe the speaker's feelings about dying in eternity. So what are those positive words that we know that she's not too upset about death coming to pick her up? Well, it says, He kindly stopped for me. And she says, I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. So that means she stopped what she was doing. She put away her work and her play, and she's going to get into the carriage. Okay, let's do one more. Number 3. Dickinson romanticizes death in this poem. Well, how do you know that? Well, death picks her up like a date in a carriage. She also uses the words gossamer and tulle, which are materials used for a wedding. Okay, let's go ahead and keep going. We're almost finished. Number 4 says there's a dose of symbolism. So how does she symbolize youth in this poem? Well, she says recess in the ring, and she says that they passed the school. Okay. Make another text box over here. Number 5. And give another example of symbolism. We talked about how the gazing grain, notice I'm just writing in phrases, not complete sentences, to go quicker. Gazing grain and setting sun symbolize old age or an end to life, right? We discussed that. Okay. So that's questions 1 through 5 and just very brief phrases for the sake of time, but you can please write them in complete sentences. Okay. All right. That's all I have for you guys today. Make sure that you have these copied down. Go ahead and watch the Tim and Moby video right here. It is about 8 minutes, but it's really good animation. So I suggest watching that right after you finish the questions. Okay. All right, guys, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I hope you've enjoyed this lesson on Emily Dickinson. I know we've done a lot of kind of dark poems. Most poets are very emotional people who write about dark things, but we will get to some more light, upbeat, and fun poems coming up. All right, have a very good rest of your day. Bye.